Friday morning, so let's catch up with New South Wales State Member for Barwon, Roy Butler. How are you this morning?
Yeah, I'm doing well, Noni. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, and there's a little bit less of you than the last time we spoke.
Yeah, I couldn't move my mouth going back a few days ago, and I thought it was perhaps another tooth coming through, but it was a tooth that I already had gone rogue, so I had to get that pulled out, which was actually a pretty, given how negative that experience can be for some people, it wasn't too bad at all. You know, they just chipped around the edge of the bone and then put some pliers in there and wiggled him around, and he came on out, and I haven't had a lot of pain since, so that's good.
Ugh, it gives me the shivers to think about it. Oh dear. But on that topic, it is health related, so let's talk regional health. The New South Wales and Victorian governments are both giving the federal government a bit of a razzle at the moment. How does that all tie into us?
Oh, look, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this has been a problem going back to, you can go back to Malcolm Turnbull, even Nick Greiner, talking about problems with regional health and the need to do something about it. And look, I suspect that the proximity to an election has something to do with this, but we need to have less talk and more action. It's all well and good to sort of rattle the cage and say we need to do more, and, we need to do something about bulk bill GPs and get people into GP clinics instead of in emergency rooms, which is what's happening. I mean, people who can't access a GP will go to emergency departments for things that should be treated in a GP's clinic, but you can't blame them. I mean, if you've got to pay, $80-90 for a consultation, and then you've also got to potentially wait for weeks to see a GP, you can understand why people go to emergency departments. So we've provided the federal government with some, partial solutions to this previously, like the rationing of Medicare provider numbers, so that once an area is saturated with Medicare provider numbers, they've got to go further west. That will take time, but at least it's going to, over time, make a difference. We've had the regional health inquiry in New South Wales, which told us what we already knew, that the health system was in deficit. We're struggling to attract and retain staff, and Ningin's a case in point where we, still haven't been able to attract and retain the nurses we need to fill those positions. There has to be a substantial systemic change. It's not just nibbling around the edges. And I think that's where governments, are typically conservative and careful and don't want to do anything that might cause a negative outcome. But, I mean, the problem is we've already got the negative outcome. So they need to be a little bit bold and a little bit brave and take some action that's actually going to make a difference. And we've seen, incentive packages for nurses and doctors who are willing to spend time in remote and very remote parts of the state and the country. And that's good. That's a good start. But obviously that's still nibbling around the edges. It's not fundamentally changing how things work. I know when I worked for the police, it was a requirement that you'd actually do service where you were posted to. So if you were posted to somewhere out in the country, you just have to go. And that's where you'd have to do at least the very first part of your service. And as you know, and I know, and your listeners know, once people get embedded in a community and become part of that community and perhaps even find a romantic interest in that community, they'll often stay. So I think, looking at some system that requires people to actually go out west and take up positions out west is where we've got to head towards, and also that rationing of Medicare provider numbers. Certainly the availability of bulk billed GPs, like we know our health outcomes in the West are not good. If people had more access to affordable healthcare, then we wouldn't have as many problems. So the way that government can do that, and the AMA doesn't like it, like I've already had pushback from the AMA on these sorts of suggestions, but I don't know what else you do. I mean, you can't leave it as it is and expect a different outcome. We've got to change things substantially to actually get people out into the West.
Now, the election, of course, as you mentioned, is coming up not too far away, which means that Labor's starting to ratchet up what their health policies are going to be. And looking through the list, it kind of sounds pretty good. They want to see additional nurses and midwives and blah, blah, blah. But then you get to the regional sort of stuff. There's an additional 500 paramedics to regional and rural communities. But then implementing the recommendations of the Rural Health Inquiry. But then it looks like all the other bits and pieces are going to go to Fairfield, Canterbury and Eurobodalla. What do you think about their current proposals in terms of how it's actually going to affect regional health on the ground?
Well, it doesn't really matter whether it's LNP or Labor. Both sides have talked about thousands of new nurse positions in regional areas at different times, and 500 new paramedics. That's fine. The problem is getting the people out there, and that's back to what we were saying before. You can't expect all of a sudden magically that just because you've got a vacant position that someone's going to fill it. We've got vacant positions all over the West at the moment. Creating new SAP positions does not create a nurse. What it does is creates a position that somebody can apply for and move into. But if we can't fill the positions we've got now, what systemic changes are going to be to actually make people want to go into those positions, or sadly force people to go into those positions, at least at the front end of their career when they finish study. And the way you could do that is, similar to what the feds are talking about, incentivise through HECS relief, so the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, the fees you pay to go to university, basically say to them, well, if you go and do 5 years in this remote place, or 7 years in this remote place, or 5 years in this quite remote place, or maybe even 3 years in a very remote place, we'll actually reimburse your HECS, but you've got to go and do your first 3 years in 3, 5, 7 years in those places. That then provides the incentive, but also makes it worth their while, because, a HECS bill can be, 40, 50 grand. So it means that they're getting a bonus, it's worth their while, they get out there. And like I said, we all know once people come to a community, if they get embedded in that community and become part of it, and maybe even find somebody who they're romantically interested in, they might stay. So getting them out there in the first instance, I think, is the most important thing. We've also got problems with visa, and I spoke with Rod about this last week in relation to Nyngan. Investment New South Wales needs to loosen their grip on visas and relax the requirements so that we can bring in overseas people who are already trained so that they can hit the ground running. At the moment, that's a blockage, for example, in Nyngan trying to fill the positions we've got there. So I think there's a lot that could be done, but announcing new positions in itself does not create a new nurse in Wilcannia or a nurse in Walgett or a nurse in Burke. It doesn't actually, all it does is create a vacant position. So you need the incentives and the structure that actually gets people out there.
The other big topic we're talking about a lot at the moment is the situation in Menindee. You'll be heading out there soon?
Yeah, I'll be heading out there over the weekend. So I'm looking. I've been in frequent contact with the SES out there, getting updates from them. Also talking to local police, talking to the council, and talking to residents as well. So looking forward to getting out there. I think the peak, the 10.7 peak that was predicted, hopefully will have passed by the time I get out there. But I think that the volunteers have done an amazing job, and we've had SES, Surf Life Saving, some RFS people. We've had people from all sorts of agencies and all over the state and country who have headed out to Menindee at different times. They've done a remarkable job. I think the frustration for the people in Menindee comes from the inaccuracy, I suppose, of the data they've been given about flooding. I mean, they were told for months they were going to be okay and they wouldn't have a problem. And then all of a sudden, bang, just before the flood hits, they're told it's going to hit 10.7, a record flood in Menindee, and there's people that have to evacuate. So you can understand there's some frustration with that, especially given the amount of money we spend on satellite monitoring, on river gauging, and we do have gauging on the Tallywalker floodplain, but obviously it's inadequate if it can't give us an accurate read on how much water is going to hit Menindee. So, I'll certainly be talking to the Premier about that, about making sure that we get that right. And I've said before on your show, I think there needs to be a review of how we've ended up in the situation where, people have been given inaccurate information. So I'll certainly be pushing him to put in place a review that then also informs the flood management plan for the Central Darling Shire Council, which is funded and due to be done. And I've spoken to the administrator at Central Darling about that, and he agrees. A review of how we've ended up in this situation would help inform the flood management plan for Menindee Town as part of the Central Darling Shire. So we'll keep working on that, and hopefully we get a positive result.
Sticking on the topic of things related to water, carp. So there's a bit of an update in terms of the situation with that issue.
Yeah. Excuse me, Noni. So we're hearing a massive increase in the biomass of carp in the system, which is to be expected, frankly, given they are such resilient fish in a bad way. The biomass of carp has increased, and that threatens to struggle to choke out, essentially, native fish, and that's a real problem for us. I know we talk about the carp herpes virus and other controls. I mean, we need to have something. We need to have something substantial that's actually going to do something about the problem, because otherwise we're going to see our native fish really struggle to survive. And also, I mean, the carp they degrade the river environment so much, with the damage they do to the banks, and they create a lot of disturbance in the water. And frankly, the native fish just can't compete. There needs to be, whether it's the herpes virus, and there needs to be 110% assurance that that's not going to cross species if that's used. But there needs to be something done to reduce the carp problem, because it's not going to go away on its own.
And just finally, there has been a big boost for financing of roads. $500 million bucks.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's 280 to regional, 220 to metro. And I know there's some people that are unhappy about the 500 million. What I would say to everyone is, look, cool your jets. That's just a start. The 50 million was the first start. The 500 million is the second start. There is a lot more money to come. We know it's not going to cost $500 million or $550 million to fix our roads. We know it's going to be in the billions. And so I've been pressuring the Premier since I first came into contact with him after the rains and after we were at the flooding in Forbes, probably going back 2 months ago, and said, look, roads are going to be your biggest issue coming out of this. And don't just repair roads or patch roads. Build them better. Build them so we're not cut off for as long. So towns like Burke and Lightning Ridge and Walgett aren't cut off for as long as they were this time. So the road itself won't get damaged as much because it's built better. But secondly, it's built higher with more drainage so that we don't end up in this situation. You know, I mean, poor old Tilpa. I know the population's small, but gee, the poor buggers have been isolated for weeks and they're probably going to be isolated for weeks more. And then there's going to be a massive repair bill for roads. So we've got to make better roads that don't leave towns cut off for as long as they've experienced in this particular event. You know, I remember we had trouble getting a fuel truck. So a lot of people at Lightning Ridge, a lot of people run off generators. And so when the town was looking like being cut off, naturally, as you'd expect, people went and bought fuel for their generator because they didn't want to run out of electricity. But what that meant was that the town pretty quickly ran out of fuel and there was just 1,500 litres left for emergency services vehicles. And then we really struggled to get a fuel tanker in to be able to replenish the town supplies. So that, to me, would be a priority to say, well, Lightning Ridge, for example, should have an access road that is an all-weather road that is built high enough that, you know, unless it's an extreme flood, we can get emergency vehicles, we can get fuel supplies, we can get food supplies in without having to do it by helicopter because, you know, that's a pretty inefficient way of moving things around. So that's something that the Premier has committed to, and he's committed to work with local, state and federal governments to actually put that in place. Now that the state has announced that $500 million, I think it's all eyes are on the federal government to see what they're going to, how they're going to kick that in, because I think they've got a role in this too. So we'll be talking to Murray Watt's office from a recovery and from an emergency management perspective about how he's going to advocate for some additional funding for our local government areas. And keeping in mind, your listeners would know, in the Barwon electorate, we've got 13 local government areas and the unincorporated area. All of those councils have their road crews out working flat out. So even if we threw $1 billion at it today or $2 billion at it today, it wouldn't change their capacity to be able to do more as a council. Transport for New South Wales has put an additional 200 road crews out, which is great. That's good news. But it's still going to take time. You know, road repair is not a fast thing, unfortunately, but I'm satisfied that the councils have the money they need. Whether or not they have the people and the equipment they need is another matter. But state government can't really help with the people and the equipment as much as the money, and they've done that at this stage, and they'll continue to do that. But I think the federal government needs to kick the tin.
Definitely. It's nice to get a bit of help from all sides, and definitely appreciating all the hard work you've done in 2022 and into 2023. Roy Butler, member for Barwon, thank you so much for catching up.
No worries, Noni. You take care and have a good day.